The New Year Honours 2007 were appointments by some of the 16 Commonwealth realms to various orders and honours to recognise and reward good works by citizens of those countries. The New Year Honours are awarded as part of the New Year celebrations at the start of January. The New Year Honours were announced on the 30th of December 2006 in the United Kingdom, New Zealand, Cook Islands, Bahamas, Grenada, Solomon Islands, Tuvalu, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Belize, Antigua and Barbuda, and Saint Christopher and Nevis. The recipients of honours are displayed as they were styled before the new honour and arranged by the country whose ministers advised the Queen on the appointments, then by honour with grades i.e. Knight, Dame, Head Cross, Knight, Dame, Commander, etc., and then divisions i.e. Civil, Diplomatic and Military as appropriate. The list is incomplete. United Kingdom. Knight Bachelor Keith Onyema Ajegbo OBE, lately head teacher, Defford Green School, Lewisham, London. For services to education, Ian Charles Franklin Andrews, CBE, TD, Second Permanent Under Secretary of State, Ministry of Defence. Geoffrey Lionel Bindman, for services to human rights. Dr. John Richard Grenfell Bradfield, CBE, for services to science, business and to the community in Cambridge. Alderman David William Brewer, CMG, JP. Robert William Kenneth Crawford, Howard Dalton, Professor Gordon William Duff, James Dyson, CBE, Professor Malcolm Green, Philip Roy Hampton, Michael de Courcy Fraser Holroyd, CBE, Kenneth Donald John MacDonald, QC, Herbert William Massey, CBE, David Edward Murray, Professor John James O'Reilly, Stephen John Lindsay Oliver, QC, Michael Derek Vaughan Rake, Professor George Peter Scott, George Albert Shearing, Kevin Smith, Professor John Edward Took, Diplomatic Service and Overseas List George Desmond Lorenz de Silva, QC, Jeffrey Nice, QC, Professor James Fraser Stoddard. Order of the Bath. Knight Commander of the Order of the Bath Military Division Lieutenant General Frederick Richard Viggers, CMG, MBE. Companion of the Order of the Bath Military Division Vice Admiral Robin Paul Bossier. Rear Admiral Philip Lawrence Wilcox, DSC. Lieutenant General Robin Vaughan Brims, CBE, DSO. Major General Keith Harrington Shima, late Corps of Royal Engineers. Major General Andrew Richard Evelyn de Cardonal Stewart, C.B.E., late Light Dragoons. Civil Division John Codling, Finance Director General, Department for Work and Pensions. Dr. Terence Robin Felgate, Director and Deputy Head, Economic and Domestic Affairs Secretariat, Cabinet Office. Richard Mitchell Henderson, Solicitor, Office of the Solicitor to the Scottish Executive. Bernard Hudden, Executive Director, Identity and Passport Service, Home Office. Dr. Colin Peter Hicks, lately Director General, British National Space Centre and member, Natural Environment Research Council. For services to science, Ronald John Marchant, Chief Executive, Patent Office, Department of Trade and Industry. Anthony Joseph Henry O'Neill, Director, Personal Tax and Welfare Reform, HM Treasury. Andrew Charles Bruce Ramsey, Director General, Culture, Creativity and Economy Group, Department for Culture, Media and Sport. Morris John Smith, lately HM Chief Inspector of Schools, Office for Standards in Education, Department for Education and Skills. Patrick Thomasdale, Permanent Secretary, Department of Agriculture and Rural Development, Northern Ireland Executive. Peter Tommy Wanless, Director, School Performance and Reform, Department for Education and Skills. Dr. David Winford Williams, lately National Hydrographer and Chief Executive, United Kingdom Hydrographic Office, Ministry of Defence. Trevor Adrian Woolley, Finance Director, Ministry of Defence. Diplomatic Service and Overseas List Drive. Geoffrey Keith Taylor, Consulate, Foreign and Commonwealth Office. Order of St. Michael and St. George. Knight Commander of the Order of St. Michael and St. George Mark Malloch Brown, formerly Deputy Secretary-General, United Nations. William Jeffrey Airman Ambassador, Beijing. John MacLeod Scarlett Director, Secret Intelligence Service. Companion of the Order of St. Michael and St. George Keith George Bloomfield, formerly Ambassador to Kathmandu. Simon James Buckle, formerly Deputy Head of Mission, British Embassy, Kabul. Professor Victor Bulmer Thomas, Director, Royal Institute of International Affairs. Andrew George Tyndale Cooper, Councillor FCO. Martin Stewart Davidson, Deputy Director General, British Council. Michael George Richardson, Councillor FCO. David Alexander Warren, Councillor FCO. Timothy Andrew Willacy Willsey, Councillor FCO. Royal Victorian Order. Knight Commander of the Royal Victorian Order Philip Allen Reid, Keeper of the Privy Purse. Alan William Waterworth, formerly Lord Lieutenant for Merseyside. Commander of the Royal Victorian Order Lieutenant General Sir John Norman Stewart Arthur, K.C.B., formerly Lord Lieutenant of the Stewartry of Kirkcudbright. Major Edward Stewart or Ewing, formerly Lord Lieutenant of Wigtonshire. John Terence Moulton Guest, formerly Executive Director of Round Square. Captain Ronald Charles Cunningham Jardine, formerly Lord Lieutenant of Dumfries. Bernard Trevor Matthews, C.B.E. for services to the Duke of Edinburgh's award. Sir Basil Henry David Montgomery, B.T., formerly Lord Lieutenant of Perth and Kinross. Peter Charles Orton, for services to children's literacy. Michael Allen Pomeroy, former partner, Hewitt. Lieutenant of the Royal Victorian Order David Kim Hempelman Adams, O.B.E.D.L. for services to the Duke of Edinburgh's award scheme. Nigel Argentine Allington, formerly Executive Director, Aon Limited. Roy Thomas Brown, M.V.O. Property Manager, London Palaces, Royal Household. Christopher James Carnegie, for services to the Duke of Edinburgh's award Charter for Business. Claire Elizabeth, Mrs. Cox, M.V.O., formerly Senior Secretary, Household of the Duke of Edinburgh. Jonathan Paul Grimwade, Manager, Royal Studs. Linda Margaret, Mrs. Hopkins, M.V.O. Clerk to the West Midlands Lieutenancy. Mary, Mrs. de Bellefoy Percy, formerly Director of Honours Chancellery, Government House, Ottawa, Canada. Colonel Christopher John Pickup, O.B.E. Secretary, Royal Warrant Holders Association. Julian Richer, formerly Non-Executive Director, Duchy Originals. Captain David John Bingham Younger, formerly Secretary, Royal Company of Archers. Member of the Royal Victorian Order Brian William Andrews, B.E.M. Superintendent, State Apartments, St James's Palace. Eric Clifford Burbeck, for services to the Queen. Inspector Peter Anthony Brown, Metropolitan Police. For services to Royalty Protection. St John Alexander Birch, for services to the Royal Collection. David George Clark, Locksmith, Fitter, Royal Household. Patricia, Mrs. Curtis, Investiture Clerk, Central Chancery of the Orders of Knighthood. David George William Fisher, Lieutenancy Officer, Lord Lieutenancy of South Yorkshire. Sergeant Piers Godwin Brandling Harris, Metropolitan Police, for services to Royalty Protection. Miss Penelope Jane Henderson, Secretary, Royal Windsor Horse Show. James Hippersley Kidner, formerly Deputy Private Secretary to the Prince of Wales and the Duchess of Cornwall. Stephen Henry Ronald Marshall, R.V.M., Yeoman of the Glass and China Pantry, Royal Household. Ian John Pepper, formerly Senior Assurance Officer, HM Revenue and Customs. John Potts, Maintenance Manager, Ascot Racecourse. David John Reed, Deputy Superintendent, Palace of Holyrood House. Michael John Taylor, Assistant to the Master of the Household, Finance, Royal Household. Ms. Josephine Elizabeth Thwaites, Project Manager, Kew Palace. Raymond Wheaton R.V.M., Page of the Chambers, Royal Household. Royal Victorian Medal Order of the British Empire, Knight Grand Cross of the Order of the British Empire, Military Division, General Sir Timothy John Granville Chapman, K.C.B. C.B.E.A. D.C. Gen. Late Royal Regiment of Artillery. Knight Commander of the Order of the British Empire, Military Division, Air Marshal Graham Anthony Miller, C.B.E. Royal Air Force. Civil Division, Diplomatic and Overseas, Professor Richard George Andrew Feachem, Executive Director, Global Fund for AIDS, Tuberculosis and Malaria. Dame Commander of the Order of the British Empire, Yasmin Bevan. Professor Margaret Mary Douglas, CBE. Professor and Patricia Dowling, CBE. Evelyn Elizabeth Ann Glennie, OBE. Professor Joan Margaret Higgins. Anne Elizabeth Mary Leslie, Mary Elizabeth Marsh, Josephine Williams, CBE, Commander of the Order of the British Empire, Military Division, Commodore Nicholas Edwin Baldock, Royal Navy, Commodore Michael Andrew Boger, Royal Navy, Commodore Anthony Stanley Miklinski, Royal Navy, Brigadier Ian Conway Dale, late Corps of Royal Electrical and Mechanical Engineers. Colonel Edward Peter Davies, M.B.E., late the Light Infantry. Brigadier John Duncan Deverell, O.B.E., late the Royal Irish Regiment. Colonel David Charles Eccles, O.B.E., late Royal Tank Regiment. Colonel David Stephen Short, late Army Air Corps. Group Captain Simon Owen Fowler, D.S.O., Royal Air Force. Group Captain Russell John Talbot, Royal Air Force. Air Commodore Peter Wally, A.D.C., Royal Air Force. Air Commodore Graham Allen Wright, O.B.E., Royal Air Force. Civil Division, Norman Ackroyd. For services to engraving and to printing, Ms. Nina Lizette Barra, Founder and Chief Executive, Walk the Walk Worldwide. For services to healthcare, Ms. Susan Barrett, Head Teacher, Bourneville Junior School, Birmingham. For services to education, Mary Helen, Mrs. Bain, C.V.O., Grade 5, Home Office. Clive Ronald Reith Bennett, Chief Executive, Driver and Vehicle Licensing Agency, Department for Transport. Dr. George Berwick, Head Teacher, Ravenswood School, Bromley, London. For services to education, John Boyington, Deputy Director General, Health and Care Partnerships and Program Director, Health and Defender Partnerships, Department of Health. Andrew Michael Bridges, HM Chief Inspector of Probation. For services to the criminal justice system, Professor Norma Brooke, lately President, Health Professions Council. For services to healthcare, Professor Alan Burns, lately Director, Diageo Scotland. For services to business in Scotland, Kevin James Patrick Cahill, Chief Executive, Comic Relief. For charitable services, Brian Carr, Chair and Chief Executive, Lincolnshire Electronics Company. For services to business in the East Midlands, Stephen Carter, Chief Executive, Ofcom. For services to the communications industry, Roger Ralph Chapman, Vice Chair, James Fisher Defence. For services to the shipping industry, the Right Reverend Alan Chesters, lately Chair, Northwest Rural Affairs Forum. For services to the community in the Northwest, Ms. Imogen Cooper, pianist. For services to music, Margaret Rosemary, Mrs. Cooper, Chair, Independent Living Funds. For services to disabled people, Miss Charlotte Copeland, Chief Executive, The Rent Service, Department for Work and Pensions. Colin Ralph Cramphorn, Q. PM, DL, lately Chief Constable, West Yorkshire Police. For services to the police, Ms. Mabel Davis, Head Teacher, Heathlands Special School, Hertfordshire. for services to special needs education. Professor Richard DeMarco, OBE, for services to the arts. Dr. Robert Royds Dixon, oceanographic and climate scientist, Center for Environment, Fisheries and Aquaculture Science, Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. Wilma, Mrs. Dixon, Head of Division, Justice Department, Scottish Executive. Barry Dixon, Q. FSM, Chief Fire Officer, Greater Manchester County Fire Service, for services to the Fire and Rescue Service. Professor Jonathan Drury, lately Director, Culture Online, Department for Culture, Media and Sport. Sheila, Mrs. Drury, OBE, lately Chair, ELWA, for services to industry, education and training in Wales. George Gordon Eddington, Chair, NCH, for services to children. Gareth Owen Edwards, MBE, for services to sport, in particular to rugby. Professor William James Feast, Emeritus Professor, University of Durham, for services to polymer chemistry. David Fish, Director, Africa, Department for International Development. Dr. Neil Goodwin, Chief Executive, former Greater Manchester Strategic Health Authority, for services to the NHS. Michael David William Gooley, Chair, Trailfinders Travel Agency, for services to the travel industry and to charity. Ms. Susan Ann Gray, Director, Propriety and Ethics, and Head of Management Unit for Private Offices, Cabinet Office. Peter Greenaway, Director, Painter and Writer, for services to the film industry. Professor Kenneth John Gregory, Vice Chair, University of Southampton Solent Governing Body, for services to geography and to higher education. Professor Haig Galvanesi, and lately Director, Construction Division, Building Research Establishment, for services to the construction industry. Ms. Roswyn Haigsley Brown, President, Royal College of Nursing, for services to healthcare. Terence David Hands, Director, for services to drama. Dr. James Morris Hart, QPM, lately Commissioner, City of London Police, for services to the police. Professor Sheila Glennis Howarth, Professor of Developmental Cardiology, Head, Cardiovascular and Respiratory Sciences, Institute of Child Health, University College London, for services to the NHS. Councillor Michael Francis Henry, Leader, Gateshead Metropolitan Borough Council, for services to local government. Professor Gordon Hewitt, Professor of International Business and Corporate Strategy, University of Michigan, for services to business. Larry Hurst, Country General Manager, IBM UK, for services to the IT industry. Professor Andrew Hopper, Professor of Computer Technology, University of Cambridge, for services to the computer industry. Ms. Margaret Howell, Fashion Designer, for services to the retail industry. Ms. Patricia Geraldine Howes, Assistant Director, Serious Fraud Office. Ms. Carol Hudson, Chief Executive, St. Helens Metropolitan Borough Council, for services to local government. Professor Donald James Jeffries, Professor of Virology and Head, Department of Medical Microbiology, St. Bartholomew's and Royal London Hospitals, for services to medicine. Ms. Penelope Ann Constance Keith, OBE, DL, Actress, for charitable services. Professor Christine Elizabeth King, DL, Vice-Chancellor and Chief Executive, Staffordshire University, for services to higher education. Ms. Angela Ann Knight, Chief Executive Officer, Association of Private Client Investment Managers and Stockbrokers, for services to the financial services industry. Professor Harry Andre Lee, Consultant Physician and Head of the Gulf Veterans Medical Assessment Program. Professor David Peter Locke, Founder, David Locke Associates and Chair, Town and Country Planning Association, for services to urban design. Christopher Logue, writer and poet, For services to literature, John David Mackey, lately Chief Executive, British Venture Capital Association. For services to business, Roger Madeline, Joint Chief Executive, Argent Group plc. For services to sustainable development, Donald Makepeace, Director, Workforce Change Team, HM Revenue and Customs. Simon Jeffrey Maxwell, Director, Overseas Development Institute. For services to international development, Professor Doreen McBarnett, Professor of Socio-Legal Studies, University of Oxford. For services to social science, Mary, Mrs. McLaughlin, Head Teacher, Notre Dame High School and Principal, Notre Dame New Learning Community, Glasgow. For services to education, Professor Anne Mills, Head, Department of Public Health and Policy, Health Economics and Financing Programme, London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. For services to medicine, Eoin Morgan, Principal, Warwickshire College. For services to further education, Peter William Mound, Chair, NHS Confederation and Chair, Central Manchester and Manchester Children's University Hospitals NHS Trust. For services to the NHS, Gavin Ellis-Neath, National Manager, Unilever UK. For services to the food industry, Professor Stephen John Nickel, lately Member, Monetary Policy Committee and Warden, Nuffield College, University of Oxford. For services to economics, Dr. Farhan Ahmad Nizami, Founder Director, Oxford Centre for Islamic Studies. For services to Islamic Studies, Richard Panaguin, Co-Chair, Egyptian-British Business Council. For services to business, Professor Barbara Ann Parfitt, Dean, School of Nursing, Glasgow Caledonian University. For services to international healthcare, Professor Michael Henry Parkinson, Director, European Institute for Urban Affairs, Liverpool John Moores University. For services to urban regeneration, David Humphrey Gavin Penny, Vice President, BT Global Business Markets. For services to the communications industry, Professor John Douglas Perkins, Vice President and Dean, Faculty of Engineering and Physical Sciences, University of Manchester. For services to science and engineering, Professor David Garrell Rees, OBE, Chair, Welsh Assembly Government's Economic Research Advisory Panel. For services to economic research in Wales, Professor Geneva Richardson, Professor of Law, King's College, University of London. For services to public law, Stephen Blakeney Ridgway, Chief Executive, Virgin Atlantic Airways. For services to civil aviation, Peter William Rogers, Director, Stanhope plc. For services to the construction industry, Paul Rogerson, Chief Executive, Leeds City Council. For services to local government, Ian Simon McGregor Russell. For services to young people and to volunteering, Dr. John Milford Rutter, composer and conductor. For services to music, David Simons. For services to the retail industry, Professor Alexander McCall Smith, writer. For services to literature, Michael John Snell, lately Principal and Chief Executive, Brockenhurst College, Hampshire. For services to further education, Ramneeklil Chaganlal Solanki, OBE. For services to publishing and community relations, Ms. Sarah Ann Spencer, Chair, Equality and Diversity Forum and Associate Director, Compass, University of Oxford. For services to equal opportunities and human rights, Ms. Hilary Susan Sperling, writer. For services to literature, Roderick David Stewart, singer and songwriter. For services to music, Jonathan Simmons, Chief Finance Officer, AstraZeneca. For services to the pharmaceutical industry, Professor Malcolm Stewart Tanner, Emeritus Professor of Pediatrics, Sheffield Children's Hospital. For services to medicine, Dr. Martin Charles Thomas. For services to software engineering, Colin Gerald Dryden Thubron, travel writer and novelist. For services to literature, Professor Stephen Tomlinson, lately Provost and Deputy Vice-Chancellor, Cardiff University. For services to medicine, Graham Edward Tuppen, Chief Executive, Enterprise Inns. For services to the hospitality industry, Dr. Patrick Charles Upson, Managing Director, Enrichment Technology Company Limited. For services to industry, District Judge Michael John Walker, Honorary Secretary, the Association of District Judges. For services to the administration of justice, Patrick Waters, JP, President, Convention of Scottish Local Authorities. For services to local government, Ms. Karen Wheeler, Change Programme Director, Her Majesty's Courts Service. John Christensen Willis, D.L., lately Chief Executive, Salford City Council. For services to local government, Ian Wilson, Corporate Director of Social Services, London Borough of Tower Hamlets. For services to social care, Primrose Eileen, Mrs. Wilson O.B.E., lately Trustee, National Heritage Memorial Fund and Northern Ireland Chair, Heritage Lottery Fund. For services to conservation and to heritage, John Wood, actor. For services to drama, Professor John Wood, Chief Executive, Central Laboratories of the Research Council. For services to science, Brig Christopher John Anthony Hammerbeck. For services to British business interests in Hong Kong, Michael Anthony Lambert, formerly Executive Vice President, Commonwealth Magistrates and Judges Association, Roger Lowen Munnings. Services to British business interests in Russia, Peter Nightingale, formerly Chief Executive, China Britain Business Council. Services to trade, Marge Jen David Niall Creo Morcho. Services to British ex-servicemen and women in Ireland, Dixon Poon. Services to UK Asia business interests, Christopher John Rodriguez. Services to British business interests and charitable works in the UK and US, Officer of the Order of the British Empire James Hugh Callum Laurie. Services to drama, Trevor Lloyd Baker. Services to the National Health Service in the West Midlands, John Michael Salisbury. Services to broadcasting, Adrian Underwood, lately National Director, Boarding Schools Association. For services to education, Professor Elaine Martin, Professor in Industrial Statistics, University of Newcastle upon Tyne. For services to science,